Welcome to this workshop by the Maryland Historical Trust. Today we'll be discussing grant writing tips in general, as well as specific tips for approaching our Historic Preservation Capital Grant application. As a quick overview of the Historic Preservation Capital Grant Program, grants in this program can be awarded up to $100,000 for construction-related preservation projects. To be eligible, a property does need to be either eligible for or listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And for this program, the most competitive applications tend to come from nonprofit organizations and local governments because there's a requirement for a high public benefit. You can see on this slide the program webpage. And here is an image of our program webpage. When you go to this site, you'll see a lot of resources for you. That's what's circled in the orange area there. The grant guidelines, copies of this slideshow, and sample questions from the application are all there for you. So when you're thinking about starting a project and looking for grant funding to support it, the first thing that you need to do is find the right grant program for your project. And so you're going to be wanting to ask yourself questions like, who's eligible? What expenses can it pay for? And what is the mission of the grant-making organization? Now, all of these things will help you find a good match for your project. So when you found a program that you want to apply for and you're getting started, keep in mind that there are a lot of resources available for you and you should definitely take advantage of them. So pretty much every program is going to have some form of grant guidelines that spell out a lot of information for you about applying and answering questions on the application. There may also be workshops like this one, and for our Historic Preservation Capital Grant Program, we also offer regular workshops when the grant round launches. And of course, program staff. They are always a great resource if you have questions, something doesn't seem clear in the guidelines, you're having trouble figuring out what sort of information to include in a specific question on the application, you can't figure out whether or not certain costs are eligible. If you have a tricky question, that's when it's time to contact program staff. They'll definitely be ready to help you. So when you get ready to approach the application itself, really the first question you should be asking yourself is, what information will the reviewers need? And this is sort of broken down in two rough categories. First, making sure that you put the most energy into the most important items, and second, making sure that your answers are clear, because those two things are going to make your application that much easier for reviewers to understand and make your application more competitive. So as far as figuring out what the most important items are, you'll want to think about what the grant maker's mission is, and then, especially if the grant maker has multiple grant programs, what is the purpose of this program? And thinking about those two items will help you figure out if your project is going to be a competitive one, and if so, how best to describe it. As far as giving clear answers, a few tips to keep in mind are that you shouldn't copy and paste the same answer for more than one question. If you're doing that, you're probably either not answering a question, and so you might lose out on points, or you are doubling up information, putting extra information in there that will just be confusing for reviewers. So if you find yourself doing that, it might be time to contact program staff and ask them what kind of information needs to go in each of these two different questions. I'm struggling with these two questions, and they'll be able to help you. Another is to be concise with your answers. Don't include a lot of extra information, or it just gets confusing for the reviewer. And finally, putting the information in the right place so that when a reviewer is looking at a specific answer to a question, they know what kind of information to expect, and they'll be able to find it in the right place in your application. Overall, what's important when you're applying for a grant? You'll be telling your story by answering 4 basic questions. Who are you as an agency? Explain your agency's mission and how your project helps that mission. And of course, describe what the project is. What would the grant pay for? Why is this project important? And finally, how you're going to make that project happen. So let's talk about applying these principles to an MHT capital grant. First off, what do we know about the Maryland Historical Trust? Well, we know that it's a government agency, and we know that it's the State Historic Preservation Office, so it focuses on Maryland's history, culture, and archaeology. So what does that mean? Well, since it's a government agency, that means that grant reviewers are going to be looking for something with a public benefit. Public agency, we want to see projects that serve the public. And because MHT is the State Historic Preservation Office, we're going to be thinking about important sites, historically speaking, and sites that convey Maryland's history, culture, and archaeology through education, educating the public. So what do we know about the Historic Preservation Capital Grant Program specifically? Since MHT does have more than one grant program, what makes this one different from the others? Well, we know it's a capital grant program, so that means we're looking at construction-related projects. So we're looking at repairing historic features, maybe architectural design, but pieces of a project that have to do with construction. And it's called the Historic Preservation Capital Grant Program, so pretty good guess that we're working on historic properties and historic elements rather than new construction. So when you're thinking about applying for this grant, you can consider whether or not the project is a good fit by thinking about, do I have a historic property? And am I working on historic aspects of that property? Does my project and my agency have a high public benefit and offer education about history to the public? And is this a construction-related project? So when you get to the application itself for the Historic Preservation Capital Grant Program, it's divided into multiple tabs. And here's a list of those tabs. I know, seems like a lot, but we've tried to break them up into topics so that there are only a few questions for each topic. And so these are the topics that you're going to have questions about. So for each tab, we have a topic. So for project design and urgency, you're talking about your construction project and what the high priority needs are. On the budget tab, you're explaining how the project is going to be funded. The public benefit tab, you're talking about the purpose, the public purpose of the site and how you engage the public. And on impact, you're talking about the impact of the project, both on the community and your organization. The significance tab has to do with the importance of your site, both in terms of its history and in terms of what it means to the community today. And then there is the property info tab, which is mostly eligibility information about the property so that we can confirm that, but you'll also provide some photos on that tab. And the project management tab just gives us a little bit of information about who's on your team. Your applicant info is just general contact and eligibility information for your organization. And finally, there's a tab where you'll be providing letters of support, and this gives you a chance to demonstrate community support of your project. So I'd like to go more in depth about a few of the tabs that relate specifically to the important scoring criteria for the Historic Preservation Capital Grant Program. As I mentioned earlier, you want to identify what's the most important to the grant maker and for the grant program. And so in this case, knowing what we identified about MHT, it's probably not too surprising that we're looking for a project that helps preserve historic features of your site or opens the site for public access. And this year, for 2021, we're also looking for projects that might help your organization or community recover from the pandemic. So if you have a capital project that relates to that, this is a great time to explain it. Public benefit and impact are also really important for this program. As I mentioned, we're a government agency, and so we really are looking for projects that have a high public benefit. So we're looking for, does your site have good access for the public? Is it ADA accessible? How are you telling the story of Maryland's history and culture? And that might be something specific to your site or in general in Maryland, but how are you telling that story? We also want to know about the site itself, its history, what it means to the local community, what it means to your organization. And finally, we need to think about the urgency of the project and your prioritization of work items. So what's going to happen if this project doesn't take place now? So that's one where you'll want to make a convincing argument that's important to move forward soon. So now I'd like to turn to these tabs and give some sample answers to application questions that relate to these topics and talk about what is good and not so good about these answers. And my note here is that most of the answers that I provide here are completely made up by me just for the purposes of this workshop, but in a few cases there were some great examples from applications in the past, and so I have used some of those word for word just to demonstrate good examples of answers. And I've noted that in the slides. So as we go through these, I will pause very briefly, but I recommend as you watch this video, just go ahead and pause when we get to the page that has all the answers so that you can read through the sample answer each time and then start the video again when you're ready to move on to the next comments. So the first tab that we're going to talk about is project design. As I said, we're really looking for projects that are obviously construction related, that's what's eligible, but that help with important historical elements. And this doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a fancy or decorative element. It could be something like siding, as you see in this picture, but it should be something that really saves what's historic about the site. So let's look at some things to include and avoid when describing your construction project. First off, include only construction tasks. You'll also want to be clear about which work the grant will fund. Be sure to start with high priority items, especially items that would protect your historic site. And finally, make sure to describe in general your project timeline and the steps that you'll need to take to complete the project. You'll want to avoid descriptions that are too broad or give too much detail. There's sort of a sweet spot in the middle. And you'll also want to avoid giving non-construction information in this section. So things like site history, why the project is happening, the mission of your organization. There are definitely sections in the application where you'll be able to address those items and make sure that those are included there for reviewers rather than when you're describing your construction project. So let's put on our reviewer caps right now as we look at these sample answers and think about, would I be able to visualize the construction project? Would I be able to figure out what the grant funds will be spent on? Do you think that a reviewer would be able to read this and understand that the proposed work is eligible or not? And does the answer give you enough information or summarize it well enough for you to understand the project? So be thinking about those things as we go through these sample answers. So this is our first set of questions and answers. And again, I will pause just briefly, but I recommend you pause the video so that you can read the answer, and then we'll go on together. For this first draft, if you were a reviewer, could you visualize this construction project? Not really. I've highlighted in red the information that we have. All we know is that the applicant wants to stabilize the building and bring it up to code, which could mean a lot of things. Maybe the building needs foundation repairs, a new roof, or both. Maybe it needs electrical rewiring or accessibility improvements. There's just not enough detail for us to know. So here is a revision of that answer. And you'll see that they have definitely elaborated on stabilization and told us about work that's going to be done. And under the grant, we know, okay, we're doing roof replacement, foundation repair, window replacement, replacement of wood damaged by termites, and drainage improvements. So I've highlighted a few things in here just to give a little bit more information about some of the things that you might receive feedback on your application during threshold review. So I'm reading through and I see the overall project description mentions treatment for termites. Well, I've got my reviewer cap on and I know that's not an eligible expense under this grant. So I'm going to be looking at the section that describes proposed grant work to make sure that's not in there. And I go through, oh, good, that's not in there. We're just going to repair the wood that's been damaged by the termites, but we're not trying to pay for the treatment for termites in the future through grant funds. Okay, good. And then in the description for the grant project, we have roof replacement and window replacement highlighted in red. So anytime as a reviewer that I see replacement, my historic preservationist little tiny red flag waves and goes, oh, we have to make sure that this meets the Secretary of the Interior standards. And so replacement is sometimes a no-no. So I might want a little more information about that, and I might reach out and ask you as the applicant to give me some clarification just to make sure we have an eligible project. And the same goes with drainage improvements. That might cause some trouble for archaeological remains, and so I might have some questions about that. This wouldn't necessarily stop your grant project from being considered, but it might change the parameters of it if you were awarded funds, just to make sure we meet those best practice criteria. So here is the final answer, all revised and tightened up. And my tip here that I've added is, it says in-kind roof replacement. So in-kind is typical language used in historic preservation to indicate that we're replacing what's currently there with essentially the same thing. We're using the same material, the same style. It's going to look the same other than that it's new. And that would be considered best practice. So when I see that, I know, okay, you're planning to replace it, but you know that there's going to be some restrictions. That's good. And I see you've also elaborated replacement of missing windows with appropriate reproductions. Okay, so now I've got a little more information. I know the windows are missing. They're not even there. So we're replacing them in the sense that we're going from nothing to something, but we're not taking out original windows, for example, and just throwing them away. We're putting in appropriate reproductions where there's something missing. So here is our second answer. And going through the answer, we'll probably notice, okay, well, they've told us about the location of the church. That's not really a description of the construction project. And there is a section in the application where you'll be asked where the church is located, so be sure to give us that. And they tell us when the church was built and when there was an addition. And again, that's useful information, but not in this section. That doesn't tell us anything about the construction project, right? So this should be in the section where you describe the building itself and the history of the building under the significance tab. Okay, we know that this is how the building is used now. It's used for educational purposes, community service, and religious purposes. Well, again, this is about the use of the building, and so it's going to be in another section. In this case, public benefit. Okay, so it's in generally fair condition. There's some maintenance problems. We should budget more funds for capital improvements. So this information relates more to the urgency of the project and how it might be prioritized, but it's pretty general and doesn't give us a whole lot of information about what kind of work we're talking about. So in the end, we don't know a whole lot about this construction project, right? All we know is that there's an assessment available as an attachment. And how much it might cost, which is a lot more than the grant can offer. The grants, as I said, are up to $100,000. So we're guessing that the grant is only going to pay for part of the work that's in the report. So we'd need to know this. So the way that you handle something like this, when you have a report from an architect, usually these are very long documents, and so it's great if you can attach them for reviewers to reference, but you want to summarize that so that reviewers clearly understand this is the project that's being undertaken now, this is the portion the grant is going to fund, and maybe you have $100,000 of your own that you're going to do the first step with, and then $100,000 from the grant is going to do the next step, and you're going to work on the other pieces of the project later, but those are the two important ones, for example. So let's see how this might be revised. So in the revised final answer, we see that the overall project gives us some clear work items that we can look at. We know they're going to repair the stained glass windows, and they've hired an architect already. They are going to they're going to replace the roof and do some electrical and plumbing upgrades, etc. Right? So we have a whole list of things that they're going to do now. So that's good. They've picked out the items from the report that they're going to work on right now. And then in the question about grant funds specifically, they let us know, aha, stained glass windows, we're going to repair those. And they gave us a little more information about how they're going to approach that part of the project, since that's the grant funded project. And they've told us that they're going to take them out to be sent to a window repair workshop off-site, and they'll temporarily close up the openings. They're going to have those windows repaired and then reinstalled, and everything will be painted and protected. So we have an idea of the steps and what's involved, but you'll notice it's not a super long answer, but it gives us plenty. We can understand the project here. It's concise, but we've got a little more detail on the grant-funded portion of work, and so we have a pretty good idea that we're going to be able to meet those best practices that I mentioned, and they didn't have to write 3 pages for us to understand that. This is just enough. And for some projects, this might be the only amount of description that you need. Others, if you have lots of work items, might take a little bit more. And so it doesn't mean you have to limit yourself to just a few sentences. Take the space that you need, but just remember that you want to balance it between how complex your project is and how much you need to describe, and just making sure that you give a clear picture. So here's our third sample, and I'll start by saying you don't need to read every single word on this page, but you'll probably very quickly get the idea that it's kind of confusing to have this much information. More is not always better. So in this instance, my guess is that this information would be something that might be pulled from an estimate from a contractor. So you should upload your estimate. It's there as a reference for reviewers. It can help them understand the details. If there's something in your summary that doesn't make sense or they're a little concerned about, they can refer back to that estimate. But you definitely do want to summarize this work so that your reviewer isn't trying to picture a project based on lists of removing soap dishes and taping drywall before it gets painted. That's a lot of work to try to summarize in your mind when you actually probably have a pretty clear idea of the project that you could describe in a few sentences. And in some instances, listing the location where certain work is going to take place can be helpful to determining eligibility, particularly for religious sites, but it's not absolutely necessary. If we're in doubt, we can always reach out to you to ask for clarification, but you don't necessarily have to go room by room in your building to describe your project. In some cases, maybe that would be the best way to approach it, but for most projects, a more generalized approach will be better. And as always, start with highest priority items. So here we've started with the bathroom and doing stalls and toilets, rather than some of the perhaps more urgent items in the work list. So here is a sample final answer where that work has been summarized. And you'll see that the applicant has added some language about when certain features were installed. And I know I said you don't have to add the history of the building in this section, but in this case, that little bit of extra information here can be helpful, because you'll notice they're talking about replacing items. And I always said there's the little tiny red flag when we talk about replacement, but in this case, we know these aren't original historic features. These are newer features that we're replacing, so it's probably not going to be an issue, and that can be helpful when we're talking about replacement. So here we have another sample set of questions and answers for you. So as a reviewer looking through this, I would have some questions. Okay, well first they're starting to describe their project, and we don't know, is the grant going to be used for architectural services or not? It wasn't really clear. They talked about it but didn't mention it, not sure. They're talking about hardscaping to improve curb appeal, and they're talking about that in the area where we're looking at grant-funded portion of the project. That's not eligible in most cases under this program. And they mentioned that there was a leaking roof, and I don't see that in here, so that again dings my little red flag saying, hey, we have a leaking roof. That's a big problem for most historic buildings. I can't think of any that it's not. So we want to make sure that that's being taken care of, either by the grant-funded portion of the project or before that takes place. So here we've revised the answer a bit. And in their overall project, they describe that they're going to hire an architect and figure out what needs to be done and produce the construction documents. And then they're going to repair the roof. Ooh, yay, that's good. And then they're going to repair the siding, and they continue on about the steps that they're going to take as part of this larger construction project. And when we get to the grant-funded portion of work, they're letting us know all the grant is going to pay for is to repair that exterior siding and paint it. So pretty simple, but we know that before that happens, they're repairing the roof. We're very happy to hear that because that's a high priority, but the siding is also a high priority. We don't want that to deteriorate or to cause water to get into the walls of the building. So we want to make sure the building is protected. So that's a good next priority to have. So we're going to move on now to the significance and public benefit tabs. And my tip here is talking about there being some overlap between the two. And these topics do have some similarities, but if you're not sure where to put something, use your best judgment. It's okay if you include a little bit of information twice, or you say, I think it fits better here for my organization. That's just fine. Reviewers will still be able to understand and evaluate that because we do understand there are some relationships between these topics. But in a nutshell, significance has to do with the story of your site, both in the past and now. What's important about your site? Versus public benefit, which has more to do with how people learn about the story of your site, how they experience the site, or how the site benefits them. So we'll turn first to significance. And I know it's easy when you hear the word significance to think, oh, maybe we're only talking about really iconic sites that people from all over would recognize. And that's not what we mean at all. Those sorts of projects can certainly be funded under this program. We funded, for example, Thomas Point Shoal Lighthouse, and I'm pretty sure most people here recognize that one and have seen photos of it in restaurants around the state and all over the place. So we know that one. It's pretty iconic. But it doesn't have to be something that has that level of recognition. It just needs to be historically important. So here's an example on the right of an archaeological site. And when you look at it, you wouldn't think to yourself necessarily, important historical site, right? But it's most likely the last remaining of its kind in Maryland, but it's an archaeological site, so you can't see it just by looking at the property itself. But we did fund a grant project to protect this site. It's an important site. Let's talk about things to include and avoid when answering questions about the significance of your property. So you'll definitely want to talk about the history of your site and what it means to the local community now. You'll also want to talk about how the site is important to the mission of your organization. And if there's any information about your site that you think MHT may not know, this is definitely the place to include it. On that note, you should avoid copying from the MIHP form. These are the inventory or informational forms that you'll find on Medusa, MHT's database of historic properties in Maryland. If you're finding the information there, that's a great place for you to get started, but that's information that we already have, so definitely don't copy that. We've already got it. Don't just give us information about a historic district if your property is located in the district. Tell us about the property itself. If you want to tell us how it fits into that district, that's fine, but we want to know about your property specifically. And don't just describe the architecture, because there's a lot more that's important about your site than just how it's built. If it is really important for its architecture, that's certainly fine to describe, but let us know what else is important about it. So putting on our reviewer cap again, in evaluating the questions in this section, let's think about whether or not we understand the history of the site. Do we know if there have been any major changes to it since it was built, a lot of additions or a big renovation project? Do we know about important events or people associated with the site? Do we understand what the site means to the local community now? And that might not have much to do with its original purpose or, when it was built. And do you understand how the site helps the applicant meet their mission today? So here is our first sample answer. And I made this bad answer up. This was all me. I took one of our AAHPP forms about a historic district and I copied it word for word and plugged it in here. So this is just a reminder. That didn't tell us a whole lot about the building itself, just a tiny little bit. It was mentioned in there, but it doesn't help us understand the site very well. So don't copy what's in that inventory form and tell us about more than just the historic district. So this one is what was actually in the application and how the applicant described their site. And I'd like to give one more example from another application about how another applicant described their site. And what you'll see in both of these answers is that the descriptions told us about the original purpose and architecture of the building, insofar as that was important. They told us how the use changed over time and how community meaning of the site changed over time. And they explained the importance of the site for the current occupant or applicant. And so we got a lot of information, and it didn't take a ton of space to explain all of that. But I don't know about you, but I felt like I had a much better understanding of the site from reading that than, say, reading a little blurb about the historic district. So turning now to public benefit, this is where we're thinking about education and how you share the stories of Maryland's history and culture. So things that you should include would be talking about any historical programming that you do at your site, but also how the public can experience your site. Because it's a historic site, we want to know that people are able to get in there and experience it. How accessible is it? And you might tell us about virtual programming. That's not going to be part of a grant project, but maybe you have implemented some recently, and that lets more people access information about your site than before. Think about including how this project might improve that public benefit or public impact. And of course, any partnerships that you have, local, state, even national partners. Things that you should avoid when you're answering questions in these sections include, don't just give us a description of activities that benefit only your organization. And don't rely on the fact that the site is historic. That's not enough of a public benefit to set you out from the rest of the crowd, because every applicant's property is historic or they wouldn't be eligible to apply. So just saying that it's a historic site and that's important to save, that's not going to get you anywhere for being competitive anyway. So putting our reviewer caps back on again, we want to make sure that we understand who benefits from this site and whether or not we understand what story is being told there. We're curious about whether or not the full story of the site is being told, or is someone being excluded, because hopefully we're telling a really full story at the site. And we also want to know how visitors are able to engage with or learn about painful history that may be associated with the site, or are there ways for visitors to take a pause and reflect and step back when that history is painful and difficult to deal with. And finally, do we understand whether or not the site is publicly accessible? And that means both being open to the public, but also being accessible to individuals with disabilities. So here is our first sample answer about public benefit. And you'll notice that this answer gave us the red avoid flag that I mentioned earlier, in that it really just talks about this being an iconic building. So it's important because it's historic, and we don't know a whole lot more than that. And the description that was provided could literally apply to any applicant in this program. So that wasn't helpful to reviewers in understanding the property or project. So here is a revised version of that answer. And it definitely gives us a better idea about who comes to use the site, how visitors learn about different themes in local history, what's going on there a little bit more. We're not just saying, oh, it's historic, that's great. So we understand a bit more about how this site is used. We have another sample answer for you. This is one that was taken from an application, and they're describing the efforts at their site to have a more inclusive history be offered at their site. And so that's a really great piece of information to have, knowing what they're doing to make this a more full story. Our third sample answer. And again, this was another one of the red avoid flags that I mentioned earlier. We're really only talking about a benefit to the congregation of this church at this point. Yes, the public could attend services, but I would bet that an organization of this type has a lot of ways that they reach out to the public and engage with the public beyond just providing services for congregants. Here is a revised answer to that question. And as you can see, the applicant has identified a lot of areas where they reach out to the public in really creative ways, some of which have to do with sharing the story of the history of their site. And I'll bet if you think about how your site does business, you will figure out some things like this as well. And we definitely want to hear about them in your application. So those tabs have some of the information that is really important for having a competitive application, but that doesn't mean that the other information isn't important or you shouldn't answer it. Much of what's left helps us figure out eligibility. And so I'm going to very briefly talk about the other tabs and just a few brief tips about those. So in the budget tab, you want to make sure that your budget accurately matches just your grant project. So don't include any other phases of work, only the grant project itself. And that would include any match if you are an applicant who's required to provide match. So just a quick tip there, if you are a nonprofit organization registered to do business in the state of Maryland, you do not provide match, but everyone else does. You want to make sure that everything in your budget is an eligible cost. And you want to make sure that in the budget tab, all of the components that put together are enough to cover the proposed phase of work, or you're explaining how you're planning to do the fundraising. So there is a question in this tab where you can describe other sources of funds that you don't report elsewhere in your budget spreadsheet, for example, so that you can talk about, oh, well, I received a bond bill grant or some other state funding, or I've applied for several grants and we haven't gotten the results yet, but it gives reviewers an idea of how you're planning to cover this whole phase of work. And it's fine if the entire phase is going to be paid for by the grant, but if we see a project that looks like, ooh, that's going to cost, $300,000 and you're only asking for the grant and you're not talking about how you're going to come up with the other funds or reduce the scope so that we could do that within $100,000, the reviewers will probably have some questions about that. For the property info tab, really the big tip that I have is making sure that we as reviewers can actually find your property. So I highly recommend taking the address of your property and plugging it into Google Maps and looking at the map and saying, yep, that's my property. It's showing up right where it should. Or, oh boy, I put my address in and it's showing me, a mile down the road. And just make sure that it shows up correctly on Google Maps. And also do the same thing for the State Department of Assessments and Taxation. The link that you see here is to the property search feature. We use this to verify who the property owner is so that it matches the letter of property owner consent that you need to provide with your application. So if you can't find your property in there, we probably can't either, but maybe together we can figure it out. So before you apply, if you're having trouble with this site, get in touch with us and we will work together to figure out all the information about your property that we need. And in some cases, uploading a map that shows the location of your property can be helpful. Now again, if I toss your address into Google Maps and it comes right up on the map and that's where it is, you don't need to provide a map. It's easy to find. But if you have something that's tricky, then go ahead and take a street map and circle the area where your property is or put an X there. It helps us to know that we're actually looking at the right place when we're looking in our database of historic properties, for example. And likewise, if you are applying for work to a building on a site that has lots of different buildings, so maybe one parcel, let's take a university campus, for example, give us a site map where you indicate the building or buildings that would be the subject of the grant property. That is extremely helpful as well. Photos. So we do ask you to provide some photos with your application, and these help reviewers to understand the overall context of your site, especially when you have an interesting setting or there's lots of different buildings. It can also help us understand the areas that are going to be the focus of grant work. Might help us understand what is the existing condition of the site and the materials. So it's sort of a way to augment your written material and your written descriptions, and can help us to figure out, oh, well, maybe that's not original fabric that you're talking about replacing. So here's an example. So we'll receive applications that show great close-ups of the areas where the work needs to be done, and that can be very helpful. But for a reviewer who's trying to understand the overall site and how this fits into the bigger picture, it's not enough. And that's why we also ask for a photo of the site. You see, aha, this is what we're talking about. And it kind of gives us an idea of how those elements that you're showing us pictures of relate to the overall property or to the building itself. Likewise, sometimes a picture of the overall property doesn't help us a whole lot. This is a project from another grant program, and when I first read the application, somehow in my mind I thought they were asking to build a new bowling alley, and I guess it just wasn't crossing my mind that, surprise, there's a 1930s bowling alley in the basement that they want to repair and return to use. The project management tab is where you're going to tell us about your project team. So if you have someone on your team already who can help you with managing the construction project, maybe you have a board member who is a contractor and can help you with this. And if not, maybe this is something that you're going to use grant funds to pay for. You're going to hire a general contractor or an architect who helps you oversee the project, and that's fine. But if you're not planning to hire someone, then we want to see, well, how are you actually going to pull this off? Do you have the expertise to do so? Likewise, who's going to be managing the grant requirements? And we want to know if someone has provided professional input for you, maybe doing an assessment or providing an estimate. You have a place where you can upload information about that. And if there are people who are going to be involved in providing services through volunteerism, for example, or helping with fundraising, you can tell us a little bit about those folks as well. Letters of support. So what I always like to say here is that quality is much better than quantity, especially if you have provided language to someone else so that they can put together a letter, a form letter. If we get 10 of the same form letter, that doesn't have a whole lot of impact as far as understanding your project and its role in the community, right? But if we get one really personal letter, for example, from a local person who has memories of the site before and is really anxious to see it restored, or a partner organization that works with you and you both used your site for a special event every year. Some of those letters are very poignant and really help reviewers to understand exactly what's important about your site. And sometimes they'll say things that you wouldn't even have thought of saying yourself. You don't realize how important certain things that you do at your site or aspects of the way your site is used might be important to other people. And so I highly recommend seeking out partners in the community, constituents, to see if one or two of them would be able to provide you with a letter of support. Now, this isn't to say that if you want to reach out to one of your elected representatives and provide them with a template or some bullet points to give them information about your project, that you shouldn't do that. No, that's great. You can do that too, because it helps keep them informed and it might generate some more interest in your project. But just keep in mind that both are great ways to show support for your project, and don't only focus on one to the exclusion of the other. So to recap, when you're looking to undertake a grant project, make sure that you find a program that's a good fit for what you're proposing and for your organization. Be sure to take advantage of those program resources. As I mentioned before, a lot of our resources are on the program webpage. When you're answering the application question, make sure that you give clear answers to those questions that paint a picture of who you are, what your project is, why it's important, and how you'll achieve it. And remember, you're sharing your passion and your site's uniqueness. You know your site and your project better than anyone else does, and you know why it's important. And so let that shine through. And I will just wrap up by saying that Barbara Fisher is the Capital Grant Administrator for the Historic Preservation Capital Grant Program, and her contact info is here. That's barbara.fisher@maryland.gov. And you can also visit our website for additional resources. That's mht.maryland.gov/grants_capital.shtml. Thanks for joining.